Hey guys, tonight we're leaving behind glowing phone screens, memory foam mattresses, and the comforting knowledge that your bedroom probably doesn't contain a goat. Instead, we're traveling back to medieval Europe, where bedtime was less of a relaxing routine and more of an adventure in endurance. So, dim the lights. Maybe switch on a fan for that soft background hum. Get comfortable beneath a blanket that, thankfully, doesn't contain hidden straw or suspicious insects. As always, settle in, let your mind wander, and allow history to do what it does best, quietly remind us that modern life isn't quite as terrible as we sometimes think. Tonight, we're exploring the wonderfully strange world of medieval sleep. Because it turns out that our ancestors had some truly bizarre bedtime habits. Some of them actually make sense. Some seem completely ridiculous. And a few will probably make you appreciate your mattress a little more before you drift off. Imagine that the sun has just disappeared below the horizon. There are no streetlights. No televisions. No phones buzzing with notifications. No one asking whether you've reached 10,000 steps today. Darkness simply arrives. It spreads across fields, forests, villages, and castles with remarkable speed. For medieval people, darkness wasn't merely the absence of light. It was an entirely different world. The familiar paths between houses suddenly became mysterious. The nearby woods felt much farther away. Every strange sound seemed louder. Every shadow looked slightly suspicious. Without electricity, most families depended on candles, oil lamps, or the fire burning in the hearth. Those things weren't exactly cheap. Candles, especially those made from beeswax, could be surprisingly expensive. Ordinary families often relied on smoky tallow candles instead, which produced just enough light to stop you from walking into the furniture while simultaneously making the whole room smell vaguely unpleasant. Not exactly scented candles. More like essence of farm. So people didn't stay awake very long after sunset. There wasn't much point. Reading was difficult. Working became nearly impossible. Even conversation slowed down as everyone grew tired. The fire crackled quietly. Someone poked at the embers. Children gradually stopped arguing. Dogs circled a few times before collapsing onto the floor. Outside, the wind pushed against wooden walls that weren't particularly interested in keeping it outside. Eventually someone simply announced it was time for bed. Not because a clock said so. Because the sun had already made the decision. Modern people often imagine medieval nights as one long stretch of uninterrupted sleep. That sounds perfectly reasonable. It's also mostly wrong. Many historians believe that medieval Europeans commonly practiced what we now call segmented sleep. Instead of sleeping for 8 continuous hours, many people naturally divided the night into 2 separate sleeps. First sleep. Then an hour or 2 awake. Then second sleep. To us, waking at 2 in the morning sounds like a problem. To them, it was simply Tuesday. After several hours of sleep, people would wake naturally. Nobody panicked. Nobody reached for a sleep tracking app. Nobody worried they had insomnia. Instead, they quietly accepted that this was simply how the night worked. During this peaceful period, people prayed. They added another log to the fire. They checked on livestock. Some repaired clothing. Others talked quietly with family members. Monks often used this time for private prayer. Farmers might quietly step outside and look at the stars before returning indoors. It was a strange little pause in the middle of the night. Almost like the world itself had pressed the pause button. Eventually everyone became sleepy again. Back to bed they went. Second sleep lasted until sunrise. Oddly enough, modern researchers have found that when people live without artificial lighting for extended periods, many naturally begin sleeping in a similar pattern. Apparently our ancestors may not have been quite as unusual as they first appear. Although waking up at midnight to check whether your pig is still where you left it remains fairly uncommon today. Probably for the best. Of course. Actually getting to sleep presented its own collection of challenges. Let's begin with the bed. Or perhaps we should lower our expectations and call it something bed-shaped. If you're imagining a soft mattress covered with crisp cotton sheets, history is about to disappoint you. Most ordinary medieval families slept on simple straw-filled mattresses known as pallets. Picture a large fabric sack. Now stuff it with dry straw. Shake it a little. Congratulations. You've just built one of Europe's most popular mattresses. Straw had advantages. It was inexpensive. Easy to replace. Reasonably warm. It also came with several less appealing features. It flattened quickly. It poked through the fabric. It collected dust. And occasionally it provided accommodation for insects that had absolutely no intention of paying rent. Every few months the straw ideally needed replacing. Poorer families couldn't always afford to do that. So the mattress gradually became less mattress. And more compressed agricultural history. If someone happened to own an actual wooden bed frame, that was considered a sign of modest prosperity. Sleeping off the floor reduced drafts. It also slightly reduced the odds of discovering unexpected wildlife sharing your pillow. Slightly. Not completely. Cats wandered wherever they pleased. Dogs considered every sleeping place negotiable. Mice held very different opinions about property ownership. Privacy was almost non-existent. Entire families often shared a single room. Parents. Children. Grandparents. Sometimes visiting relatives. Sometimes servants. Everyone simply found somewhere to lie down. Personal space wasn't really part of medieval architecture. If someone snored loudly, well, you simply accepted that this was now everyone's problem. Meanwhile, castles looked far more impressive from the outside than they felt at night. Movies love showing enormous stone castles glowing romantically beneath the moon. Reality was rather colder. Stone is excellent for building strong walls. It is considerably less enthusiastic about staying warm. Throughout winter, castle bedrooms could become remarkably chilly. Massive fireplaces helped. Heavy curtains helped a little. Thick wool blankets helped somewhat. But cold still managed to sneak into almost every corner. Which explains why medieval people often wore sleeping caps. Yes. Nightcaps were originally actual hats. Not drinks. Not bedtime routines. Literal hats. Heat escaped surprisingly quickly through the head. Whether medieval people fully understood the science behind that is another question. But they certainly understood that cold ears make sleeping unpleasant. So they wrapped their heads in wool or linen caps before climbing into bed. Entire generations quietly went to sleep dressed like sleepy garden gnomes. Fashion occasionally takes unexpected journeys. Some nobles even owned beautifully embroidered nightcaps. Because apparently if you're wealthy enough, even your sleeping hat needs decorative stitching. Imagine explaining luxury branding to a medieval lord. He'd probably respond by requesting gold thread for his bedtime bonnet. Because naturally. And warmth. Warmth was worth almost anything. Poor families often shared beds simply because several human bodies generated more heat than one. Children piled together beneath blankets. Parents squeezed into whatever space remained. Occasionally a family dog decided everyone required additional supervision. Nobody complained very much. Free central heating with 4 legs was difficult to criticize. Some farmhouses went even further. Livestock frequently occupied the same building as the family. Not because people were unusually fond of cows. Although they certainly appreciated them. Animals produced warmth. Quite a lot of it. During freezing winters, having livestock nearby genuinely helped maintain slightly higher temperatures indoors. The arrangement wasn't glamorous. It also wasn't particularly fragrant. Imagine trying to sleep while a goat develops strong opinions 3 feet away. Or a rooster begins reconsidering tomorrow's schedule several hours early. Still, when the alternative involved freezing through the night, a noisy goat suddenly became an acceptable roommate. And perhaps that's the most fascinating thing about medieval sleep. Almost every strange habit had a perfectly sensible reason. People weren't trying to be unusual. They were simply doing everything possible to survive another cold night. And as we'll discover next, some of their bedtime rituals became even stranger once fear, superstition, and religion quietly climbed into bed beside them. Now that everyone had finally settled onto their straw mattresses, adjusted their sleeping caps, and negotiated who was accidentally kicking whom beneath the blanket, the hardest part of the night was only beginning. Because medieval people didn't simply believe darkness was dark. They believed darkness belonged to someone else. During daylight, the village felt familiar. Neighbors worked in nearby fields. Children chased chickens. Blacksmiths hammered away. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys. Life made sense. But once the sun disappeared, ordinary places suddenly felt unfamiliar. The narrow path leading to the well looked different. The old oak tree outside the village seemed taller than anyone remembered. Every gust of wind sounded almost intentional. Without electric lights, the human imagination happily filled in whatever the eyes couldn't quite recognize. And unfortunately, the imagination rarely chose something friendly. Many medieval Europeans sincerely believed nighttime was when supernatural forces became busiest. Demons, restless spirits, witches, fairies, ghostly travelers, creatures hiding somewhere beyond the glow of the fireplace. To modern ears it sounds wonderfully dramatic. To them, it was simply another practical concern before going to sleep. Just as today we might lock the front door before bed. They prayed. Quite a lot. Before lying down, families often recited evening prayers together. Not because bedtime routines were fashionable. Because nobody truly knew whether they would wake up again. Life expectancy was short. Disease appeared without warning. A simple infection could become fatal. A house fire could erase everything before sunrise. Winter itself sometimes felt like an enemy waiting patiently outside. Going to sleep carried an uncomfortable reminder. Sleep looked surprisingly similar to death. So every evening became a quiet moment of preparation. People confessed sins. Asked for forgiveness. Prayed for protection over children. Prayed for healthy animals. Prayed the roof stayed standing. Prayed tomorrow would simply arrive. There is something strangely peaceful about that. In a world filled with uncertainty, prayer became the closest thing many people had to security. No insurance. No emergency services. No hospitals. Just hope. And perhaps one extra log on the fire. Dreams carried enormous importance too. Today, if someone dreams they're being chased by an unusually determined goose, they usually laugh about it over breakfast. Medieval people approached dreams rather differently. A dream could be a warning. A message from God. A temptation sent by the devil. Advice from a saint. Or evidence that your soul was wandering somewhere it probably shouldn't. Imagine waking after dreaming about fire. Instead of thinking, well, that was strange. You might spend the entire next day wondering whether heaven, hell, or your local priest needed immediate attention. Some monasteries even encouraged monks to discuss particularly vivid dreams. Not because dreams were entertaining. Because they might reveal hidden spiritual weaknesses. A frightening nightmare could become tomorrow's theological discussion. An especially beautiful vision might inspire additional prayers. Even kings occasionally consulted religious advisors about unusual dreams. Which seems like quite a lot of responsibility for something caused by eating too much cheese before bed. Although medieval dinners probably contained considerably less cheese than modern legends suggest. Still, dreams mattered. The sleeping mind remained mysterious. Perhaps it always will. Of course. There was another reason people preferred not to sleep alone. Warmth helped. Family helped. But company also offered reassurance. If strange noises echoed outside during the middle of the night, someone else heard them too. If the roof creaked, everyone noticed. If a wolf howled somewhere beyond the village, well, at least you weren't listening alone. Modern bedrooms are wonderfully quiet. Sometimes almost too quiet. Medieval nights were full of sound. The fire popped unexpectedly. Wooden beams settled with loud cracks. Wind slipped through tiny openings between stones. Dogs barked at things nobody else could see. Owls called across dark fields. Livestock shifted in nearby stalls. Occasionally an unfortunate rooster completely misunderstood what time morning actually began. Every sound demanded attention. Every unexplained noise carried possibilities. Some ordinary. Some supernatural. Some simply annoying. Eventually exhaustion usually won. People had spent the entire day farming, cooking, carrying water, chopping wood, repairing fences, feeding animals, sewing clothing, or doing dozens of other physically exhausting jobs. Sleep arrived quickly. Even when accompanied by suspicious noises. Travelers, however, had an entirely different bedtime experience. Imagine you've spent 12 hours walking muddy roads. Your boots are soaked. Your shoulders ache. Rain has followed you for half the afternoon. Finally you discover an inn. Wonderful. Except, there aren't enough beds. That wasn't unusual. Privacy wasn't considered essential. Available space mattered far more. So complete strangers frequently shared beds together. Not because everyone instantly became friends. Because sleeping outside was considerably worse. You might find yourself lying beside a merchant. A pilgrim. A carpenter. Perhaps someone whose profession remained politely unexplained. Everyone simply accepted the arrangement. Snoring became public entertainment. Blankets became shared property. Personal bubbles hadn't yet been invented. If someone rolled over, half the bed noticed. If someone talked in their sleep, everyone unintentionally joined the conversation. The wealthy naturally avoided much of this inconvenience. Nobles often traveled with servants, wagons, personal bedding, and enough supplies to create a comfortable temporary household wherever they stopped. Being rich has always improved travel. Some traditions never change. Inside monasteries, comfort reached entirely new levels of inconvenience. Monks viewed excessive comfort with deep suspicion. A bed wasn't supposed to feel luxurious. Luxury encouraged laziness. Laziness encouraged temptation. Temptation encouraged sin. Therefore, comfortable mattresses seemed spiritually risky. Simple solution. Make sleeping slightly uncomfortable. Many monks slept on plain wooden beds covered with thin straw mattresses. Some used little more than blankets. Pillows were modest. Rooms remained cold. Silence remained absolute. Talking after evening prayers wasn't encouraged. Instead, dozens of monks rested quietly together beneath heavy wooden roofs while candlelight gradually disappeared. Then, hours later, the bell rang. Not because breakfast was ready. Because it was time to wake in the middle of the night. Imagine being peacefully asleep. Suddenly, a bell echoes through stone corridors. You climb out of bed. Pull your robe tighter against the cold. Walk silently through dark hallways. Stand inside a chilly chapel. Then begin chanting prayers while your body desperately argues that none of this seems necessary before sunrise. For monks, this wasn't unusual. It was discipline. Sleep served God. Even tiredness served God. Comfort came later. Hopefully. Meanwhile, ordinary villagers had simpler ambitions. Survive winter. Protect the harvest. Keep everyone healthy. Avoid disasters. Get enough sleep to repeat everything tomorrow. History often describes medieval life through kings, queens, castles, and famous battles. But most people never experienced any of those things. Their greatest nightly victory wasn't defeating invading armies. It was waking up warm enough to start another day. There's something surprisingly comforting about that thought. Across hundreds of years, millions of ordinary people climbed into imperfect beds after long days of honest work. They worried about tomorrow. Laughed with family. Prayed quietly. Listened to rain against wooden roofs. Then closed their eyes beneath blankets filled with far more optimism than feathers. And despite cold rooms, creaking houses, snoring relatives, wandering animals, and imaginations full of mysterious creatures waiting somewhere beyond the firelight, they slept. Not perfectly. Not comfortably. But well enough to build villages. Raise families. Work fields. Construct cathedrals. And leave behind the wonderfully strange bedtime traditions we're still talking about centuries later. So before you drift off tonight, take a quiet moment to appreciate your mattress, your warm blanket, and the comforting absence of a goat trying to share your pillow. Because next time, we're venturing even deeper into the stranger side of medieval nights, where bizarre bedtime superstitions, haunted castles, royal sleeping rituals, and some truly unusual beliefs made bedtime far more complicated than simply turning out the light. By now, you've survived your first medieval night. You found a place to sleep that was generously described as a mattress. You accepted that personal space was mostly a modern invention. You discovered that sharing your bedroom with family, livestock, and perhaps one overly confident rooster wasn't unusual. And somehow, you managed to fall asleep anyway. Unfortunately, staying asleep was only half the challenge. Because once your eyes closed, medieval people believed an entirely different world woke up. It was a world filled with invisible dangers. Some were real. Most were imagined. And nearly all of them were taken very, very seriously. Let's begin with one of humanity's oldest nighttime fears. The thing hiding in the darkness. Today, if your house creaks at 2 in the morning, you probably blame the heating system. Or perhaps the cat. Maybe the neighbor closing a car door. Eventually you roll over and go back to sleep. A medieval villager rarely enjoyed that luxury. Every strange sound demanded an explanation. The scratching inside the walls. The footsteps outside. The sudden gust of wind that pushed open a poorly fitted wooden door. Even an owl calling from the forest could become a reason to quietly grip the blanket a little tighter. Darkness encouraged imagination. And imagination worked overtime. Many people believed evil spirits preferred the night. After all, daylight belonged to ordinary life. Night belonged to mysteries. If someone became ill after sunset, perhaps a spirit had visited. If a child woke screaming from a nightmare, perhaps something unseen had entered the room. If livestock became restless during the night, surely they sensed something humans could not. Animals, people believed, often noticed supernatural visitors before anyone else. A barking dog wasn't always just barking. A frightened horse wasn't simply nervous. Sometimes, according to medieval thinking, they were warning everyone. Naturally, people developed ways to protect themselves. A simple wooden cross might hang above the bed. Some families kept small religious relics nearby. Others placed blessed branches over the doorway after church festivals. A prayer before sleep wasn't merely comforting. It was considered practical. Rather like locking your front door. You hoped nothing unpleasant would happen. But there was no reason to tempt fate. Children learned these routines from an early age. Just as modern children are reminded to brush their teeth before bed. Medieval children were reminded to pray carefully. Their parents sincerely believed those prayers mattered. Not just spiritually. Physically. Protection could come through faith. Or so they hoped. Of course. The church wasn't the only source of bedtime traditions. Local folklore had plenty to contribute. Across Europe, every region had its own collection of mysterious nighttime visitors. In Ireland, stories spoke of wandering fairies. In parts of Germany, strange forest spirits appeared in village tales. Scandinavian legends warned about hidden creatures that disliked careless humans. Meanwhile, English folklore happily filled the countryside with ghosts, goblins, and mischievous beings that seemed determined to interrupt everyone's sleep. Oddly enough, not all supernatural creatures were considered completely evil. Some simply enjoyed causing inconvenience. Imagine spending an hour carefully stacking firewood. Then waking to discover it scattered across the yard. A mischievous household spirit. Milk suddenly spoiled overnight? Probably not bad luck. Clearly something invisible had become annoyed. Your bread failed to rise. Your chickens stopped laying eggs. Your socks disappeared. Well, perhaps not the socks. But almost everything else found its way into folklore eventually. Human beings have always preferred interesting explanations over boring ones. Then there were nightmares. Today we usually blame stress. Too much coffee. Or watching horror movies before bed. Medieval people often blamed entirely different causes. Nightmares could be signs of temptation. Warnings. Punishments. Or direct attacks from evil forces. Some believed demons attempted to influence sleeping minds. Others believed sinful thoughts naturally attracted frightening dreams. This created an awkward problem. How exactly were you supposed to control your thoughts while asleep? Nobody seemed entirely sure. Still, people tried. Even sleeping position occasionally attracted attention. Certain religious writers warned against excessive comfort. Others encouraged modesty during sleep. Apparently your soul remained remarkably busy while the rest of you was unconscious. One particularly fascinating belief involved the soul itself. Many ordinary people imagined that while sleeping, the soul became freer than during waking life. Not completely separated from the body, but somehow less firmly attached. This helped explain dreams, visions, sleepwalking. Even the strange sensation of suddenly waking after dreaming you were falling. Rather than understanding the brain's complicated sleep cycles, they understood the experience through faith. And honestly, given the knowledge available at the time, it wasn't an unreasonable attempt. Human beings naturally search for explanations, even when none exist. Speaking of sleepwalking, few things frightened medieval communities more than someone calmly wandering through the village while completely asleep. Today doctors recognize sleepwalking as a sleep disorder. Back then, people weren't so certain. Imagine waking in the middle of the night and discovering your neighbor standing silently outside your house. Eyes open. Face expressionless. Barefoot. Completely asleep. That's unsettling even now. Several hundred years ago, it was downright terrifying. Some assumed demons had taken control. Others believed the sleeper's soul had wandered away. A few suspected witchcraft. The sleepwalker usually remembered nothing, which somehow made the entire situation even stranger. Fortunately, most sleepwalkers simply wandered a few steps before returning to bed. Unfortunately, that wasn't nearly mysterious enough for medieval imaginations. Now imagine trying to sleep inside a castle. It sounds romantic. Large stone walls. Massive fireplaces. Beautiful tapestries. Moonlight shining through narrow windows. Reality was considerably less magical. Castles echoed constantly. Wind rushed through corridors. Doors creaked. Chains rattled. Guards walked the walls throughout the night. Somebody always seemed to be moving somewhere. Servants carried firewood. Stable boys checked horses. Night watchmen called to one another from towers. If you happen to believe ghosts occupied ancient castles, well, the buildings certainly provided excellent sound effects. Every echo acquired its own story. Every unexplained noise eventually became someone's favorite ghost tale. It's no coincidence that so many famous haunted castles date back to the Middle Ages. Old buildings naturally create mysterious sounds. Human imagination happily supplies mysterious residents. Even kings and queens, despite their wealth, couldn't entirely escape medieval bedtime anxieties. Royal bedrooms looked magnificent. Heavy curtains. Fine linens. Feather mattresses. Beautiful carved furniture. Compared with peasant homes, they seemed almost unimaginably luxurious. But darkness ignored social class. Kings still worried about illness. Queens still feared difficult winters. Royal physicians still struggled to explain disease. A comfortable bed couldn't prevent nightmares. Nor could embroidered blankets keep away superstition. If anything, wealth often encouraged even stranger rituals. Royal households employed priests, personal chaplains, physicians, astrologers, everyone offering different advice about health, sleep, dreams, and divine protection. Imagine trying to follow all those bedtime instructions. One person recommends extra prayer. Another suggests herbal medicine. Someone else insists your dreams predict tomorrow's politics. Eventually, going to bed becomes surprisingly complicated. And perhaps that's the most remarkable thing about medieval nights. Everyone, from the poorest farmer sleeping beside a goat, to the richest king beneath embroidered curtains, closed their eyes with many of the same hopes. Please let tomorrow arrive. Please let my family remain safe. Please let the harvest survive. Please let the strange noise outside simply be the wind. Because once darkness settled across medieval Europe, certainty disappeared with the sunlight. Only the fire remained. Only whispered prayers. Only stories passed from one generation to the next. And those stories would become some of the strangest bedtime traditions in human history. By this point, you've finally drifted into your second sleep. The fire has burned low. The wind outside has grown quieter. The dog has stopped barking at whatever invisible mystery occupied his attention 15 minutes ago. For one peaceful moment, everything feels calm. Unfortunately, you've forgotten about the fleas. Modern bedtime usually involves checking whether your phone is charging. A medieval bedtime often involved checking whether something was already chewing on you. Not exactly the same experience. Let's begin with an uncomfortable truth. No matter how clean someone tried to be in the Middle Ages, keeping insects away was incredibly difficult. Most homes had dirt floors or rough wooden boards. Windows rarely closed tightly. Animals wandered in and out throughout the day. Straw mattresses were replaced when families could afford it, but they were never completely free of tiny visitors. And those visitors had absolutely no intention of respecting anyone's sleep schedule. Fleas arrived first. Tiny. Quick. Persistent. They treated every sleeping human as an all-you-can-eat buffet that never officially closed. Then there were lice. Nearly everyone encountered them at some point. Rich. Poor. Merchant. Farmer. Even members of royal households occasionally dealt with them. Money could buy silk sheets. It could not guarantee an insect-free night. There is something strangely equal about fleas. They showed very little interest in social class. A peasant scratching his arm and a noble scratching beneath embroidered sleeves had more in common than either would probably admit. Of course, nobody enjoyed this. People constantly searched for ways to reduce the problem. Some scattered fragrant herbs beneath mattresses. Lavender, rosemary, mint, wormwood, and other strongly scented plants were believed to discourage insects. Sometimes they actually helped a little. Sometimes they simply made the room smell pleasantly herbal while the fleas continued their dinner. History is full of optimistic experiments. This was certainly one of them. Then came the bedbugs. If fleas were irritating neighbors, bedbugs were determined long-term tenants. Unlike fleas, which jumped from place to place, bedbugs preferred remaining close to where people slept. They hid inside cracks in wooden bed frames, behind loose boards, inside seams of mattresses. During the day they remained almost invisible. At night, they quietly emerged. It's a strategy they continue using today. Some traditions never disappear. People sometimes carried bedding outdoors into bright sunlight, hoping heat would drive pests away. Others beat mattresses with sticks until clouds of dust rose into the air. This certainly looked productive. Whether the bedbugs agreed is another matter entirely. Clothing didn't escape either. Most medieval people owned very few outfits. A wealthy merchant might possess several changes of clothing. An ordinary farmer often had one set for daily work and perhaps slightly nicer garments reserved for church or important celebrations. Because clothing was valuable, it wasn't washed every few days. Soap existed, but making it required time and resources. Water had to be carried. Wood gathered. Large fires prepared. Laundry became an enormous task. As a result, clothing stayed in use for long periods. Warm wool. Heavy linen. Layers worn through every season. Comfortable enough. Perfectly practical. Also wonderfully attractive to insects looking for somewhere cozy to hide. It's difficult to appreciate modern washing machines until you've imagined cleaning medieval laundry by hand beside an icy stream in February. Suddenly that pile of clothes waiting in your bedroom feels remarkably less offensive. Then there was the smell. Modern life has quietly spoiled us. We expect bedrooms to smell, mostly like nothing. Perhaps fresh linen. Maybe lavender. Occasionally yesterday's forgotten coffee. Medieval homes offered a rather broader collection of aromas. Smoke from the fireplace settled into clothing. Animals contributed enthusiastically. Cooking smells lingered long after supper ended. Wet boots dried beside the fire. Fresh straw smelled pleasant for a while. Old straw. Less so. Yet remarkably, people adapted. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to become accustomed to familiar surroundings. What would overwhelm a modern visitor after 5 minutes eventually became ordinary life. The villagers probably noticed fresh air far more than everyday smells. Normal is simply whatever surrounds us long enough. Now imagine winter arriving. Not modern winter. Not a quick walk from a heated house to a heated car. A genuine medieval winter. Snow covering the fields. Ice forming inside water buckets. Wind slipping through every tiny gap between wooden boards. The fireplace became the center of everything. Cooking happened there. Conversation happened there. Work happened there. Eventually, sleep happened nearby as well. Families gathered as close to the remaining warmth as possible. Blankets were layered carefully. Children tucked into the safest places. The oldest family members often received the warmest spots. The fire wasn't allowed to die completely. Someone usually banked the embers beneath ashes before bed. With luck, enough heat remained to restart the flames in the morning. Without luck, someone spent dawn trying to persuade damp wood to burn while everyone else quietly regretted yesterday's decisions. Fire represented survival. Without it, winter became far more dangerous than uncomfortable. Animals understood this too. Cats curled beside warm stones. Dogs stretched near the hearth. Even chickens occasionally wandered indoors seeking warmth. Nobody found this especially surprising. It simply happened. A modern homeowner might become slightly concerned discovering a chicken beside the fireplace. A medieval family probably just stepped around it. Life was wonderfully practical. If something provided eggs, caught mice, or warned about strangers, it earned certain privileges. Sometimes those privileges included sleeping indoors. Despite everything we've talked about, the insects, the smells, the cold, the crowded rooms, people still slept. Not because conditions were pleasant. Because they were exhausted. A medieval day demanded constant physical effort. Fetching water. Grinding grain. Repairing fences. Milking cows. Gathering firewood. Walking miles. Digging fields. Spinning wool. Mending tools. The body eventually reached a point where sleep arrived almost immediately. Modern insomnia often grows from busy minds. Medieval exhaustion usually began with busy hands. By sunset, muscles made most bedtime decisions. Even a lumpy straw mattress could feel wonderfully inviting after 14 hours of labor. Perhaps that's one lesson worth remembering. Perfect conditions have never been required for good sleep. Sometimes the body simply says, "That will do," and closes its eyes. As the fire faded into glowing embers, the room gradually became quieter. Children breathed softly beneath thick wool blankets. The family dog twitched while chasing imaginary rabbits through dreams. Outside, the village disappeared beneath the stars. Tomorrow would begin before sunrise. The animals would need feeding. The fields would still be waiting. Life would continue exactly as it had for generations. But before dawn arrived, one more strange medieval bedtime belief still waited in the darkness. Because many people genuinely feared that while their bodies rested, their souls might be wandering somewhere entirely different. And that curious belief takes us into the next part of our journey. By now, you've survived several medieval nights. You've shared your bedroom with family. You've negotiated peace with fleas that had absolutely no interest in diplomacy. You've accepted that the house creaks for reasons nobody fully understands. And you've probably started thinking that life as a king must have been much easier. After all, if anyone deserved a good night's sleep, surely it was the king. Well, not exactly. Royal bedrooms looked magnificent. Visitors entering one for the first time would have been impressed immediately. Tall wooden beds stood proudly beneath richly carved canopies. Heavy velvet curtains surrounded the mattress. Fine linen sheets rested beneath thick wool blankets. Animal furs covered the bed during winter. Candles flickered against polished furniture. Colorful tapestries decorated cold stone walls. Everything looked warm. Everything looked expensive. Everything looked comfortable. The appearance, however, was doing quite a bit of the work. Because underneath all that luxury, the room was still inside a giant stone castle. And stone is wonderfully loyal to the cold. During winter, thick castle walls absorbed icy temperatures throughout the night. Fireplaces burned almost constantly, but warming one room was difficult enough. Heating an entire castle was practically impossible. Servants carried armfuls of firewood from dawn until dusk. Massive logs disappeared into enormous fireplaces. Yet only a few steps away from the flames. Cold air quietly waited. Kings often slept beneath several heavy blankets. Not because luxury demanded it. Because freezing was unpleasant regardless of social class. A crown never made winter shorter. Royal beds themselves were engineering projects. Unlike the simple straw pallets used by most villagers, noble beds were carefully constructed from sturdy oak. Ropes stretched tightly across the wooden frame. On top of those ropes rested mattresses stuffed with feathers, wool, or soft plant fibers. At least, that was the goal. The ropes gradually loosened over time. Servants had to tighten them regularly. Otherwise the mattress sagged in the middle. This is actually where the old saying, "sleep tight," is believed to come from. The ropes needed to remain tight so the bed stayed comfortable. Whether every historian agrees with that explanation is another matter. But it certainly paints a memorable picture. Imagine employing someone whose morning responsibility involved tightening your bed with a wooden crank. Royal life included some wonderfully specific jobs. Then there were the curtains. Modern people often think bed curtains existed purely for decoration. They certainly looked impressive. But their main purpose was practical. Curtains trapped warm air around the sleeper. Think of them as a medieval sleeping tent. They also offered a little privacy. A little. Because privacy inside royal households was surprisingly limited. Kings rarely slept completely alone. Not because they disliked solitude. Because servants remained nearby almost constantly. Someone maintained the fire. Someone guarded the chamber. Someone remained available in case the king needed water, clothing, medicine, or assistance during the night. Power came with company. Even while sleeping. Imagine trying to enjoy a peaceful night's rest knowing several attendants occupied nearby rooms, guards stood outside the door, and half the kingdom depended on your continued existence. Pressure has an unusual way of following people into bed. Queens experienced their own nighttime routines. Particularly after giving birth. Childbirth was dangerous. Recovery could take weeks. Rooms were kept unusually warm. Windows often remained closed. Heavy curtains blocked drafts. Friends, servants, nurses, and ladies-in-waiting moved quietly around the chamber. The queen herself might spend long hours resting beneath layers of blankets. Her bedroom temporarily became something between a hospital, a nursery, and a small government office. Visitors arrived. Priests offered prayers. Physicians suggested treatments of varying usefulness. Herbal mixtures appeared. Some probably helped. Others probably tasted terrible. Medicine during the Middle Ages was enthusiastic. Accuracy occasionally struggled to keep up. Royal physicians believed sleep itself possessed healing powers. In fairness, they weren't entirely wrong. Good sleep genuinely helps the body recover. Where things became more interesting was their explanation. Many medieval doctors followed the ancient theory of the four humors. According to this idea, the human body depended on maintaining balance between blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Too much of one humor supposedly caused illness. Too little of another created different problems. Sleep, food, exercise, weather, and even emotions all influenced this delicate balance. If a king struggled to sleep, the solution might involve changing his diet, or adjusting the room temperature, or drinking herbal preparations, or, unfortunately, bloodletting. Because if something seemed wrong, removing blood somehow became the answer surprisingly often. History occasionally displays remarkable confidence, even when entirely misplaced. Of course, the king wasn't the only important sleeper inside the castle. Babies occupied a special place in medieval households. Especially royal babies. A healthy prince represented the future of an entire kingdom. A healthy princess might one day secure peace through marriage. Their survival mattered enormously. Infant mortality remained painfully high throughout the Middle Ages. Parents understood this reality all too well. Royal nurseries therefore became places of constant attention. Nurses watched carefully. Cradles rocked gently. Candles burned softly through the evening. Prayers were offered daily. Every cough attracted concern. Every fever brought physicians. Every peaceful night's sleep felt like a small victory. Even kings couldn't command illness to leave. Children, whether royal or ordinary, often slept differently than modern youngsters. Very young children commonly shared sleeping spaces with parents or nurses. Not simply for affection. Warmth mattered. Safety mattered. Convenience mattered. If a baby cried during the freezing hours before dawn, it helped enormously if someone already slept nearby. There were risks too. Parents worried constantly about accidents. Many communities developed careful traditions surrounding infant sleep. Advice passed from grandparents to parents for generations. Some ideas were practical. Others belonged more to folklore than medicine. Separating the two wasn't always easy. Now imagine the castle after midnight. The feast has ended. The musicians have stopped playing. Candles burn lower. Servants quietly clear away cups and plates. Somewhere outside, a guard calls to another across the walls. The sound echoes through empty courtyards. Wind brushes against banners hanging from the towers. A horse stamps impatiently inside the stable. Far below, the kitchens finally grow quiet. For a brief moment, the entire castle seems asleep. Except, it never truly is. Someone always remains awake. Guards patrol the walls. Kitchen servants prepare tomorrow's bread. Stable hands check valuable horses. Watchmen scan the darkness beyond the gates. Castles never completely rested. They merely became quieter. Even kings slept surrounded by people still working. Perhaps that's the greatest surprise about medieval royalty. Luxury solved many problems. It did not eliminate worry. Kings feared rebellion. Queens feared illness. Princes feared disappointing powerful fathers. Princesses often faced marriages arranged for politics rather than love. A feather mattress could soften your back. It couldn't quiet an anxious mind. In that way, royalty and peasants shared something remarkably human. Both closed their eyes hoping tomorrow would be kinder than yesterday. Both listened to storms passing overhead. Both wondered what the morning might bring. Sleep remained the one kingdom where crowns carried very little advantage. And as dawn slowly approached over castles, villages, and monasteries alike, another curious medieval habit quietly awaited us. Not in the bedroom, but in the surprisingly complicated ritual of waking up. Eventually, the darkness began to retreat. Not all at once. There was no alarm clock buzzing from a bedside table. No phone lighting up with overnight notifications. No cheerful weather app promising partly cloudy skies. Morning arrived slowly. Almost politely. The black sky faded into deep blue. Then gray. Then a pale orange glow crept across the horizon. Long before the sun actually appeared, the village was already beginning to stir. For medieval people, waking up wasn't a single moment. It was a gradual return to life. And unlike many of us today, there was rarely any temptation to hit the snooze button. Mostly because snooze buttons wouldn't exist for another several hundred years. And also because the cows were remarkably impatient. The very first sounds usually came from the animals. Roosters, despite their reputation, weren't perfect timekeepers. Some crowed before sunrise. Others waited until daylight had already arrived. A particularly enthusiastic rooster might decide 3 in the morning looked close enough. Nobody had informed him about schedules. Nearby dogs stretched themselves awake. Horses stamped their hooves inside the stable. Cows shifted impatiently, already expecting to be milked. Sheep announced their presence. Goats, naturally, found reasons to complain. If you've ever stayed somewhere completely surrounded by farm animals, you'll know they possess an extraordinary ability to become noisy exactly when you'd rather remain asleep. Apparently this talent has survived the centuries. Inside the house, the fire demanded immediate attention. Remember those glowing embers carefully buried beneath ashes before bedtime? Now came the important question. Had they survived the night? If they had. Wonderful. Someone gently uncovered the warm coals. Dry twigs were placed carefully on top. Small pieces of wood followed. Then larger logs. With a little patience. And a little luck. The flames returned. Morning could begin. If the fire had died completely, things became considerably more frustrating. Starting a brand new fire wasn't impossible. It simply required time. Flint. Steel. Dry tinder. Steady hands. And preferably children who weren't asking whether breakfast was ready every 30 seconds. In winter, losing the household fire overnight could feel like beginning the day several steps behind. Before breakfast, there was work. Always work. Modern mornings often begin with coffee. Perhaps checking messages. Maybe reading the news. Medieval mornings began with responsibility. The animals needed feeding. Water had to be collected. Bread dough prepared. Chickens released into the yard. Wood carried indoors. The day's tools gathered together. Nobody asked whether they felt motivated. The harvest wasn't particularly interested in motivation. Fields waited. Weather waited for no one. Winter certainly waited for no one. So people got moving. Not because they always wanted to. Because life demanded it. For farmers, sunrise acted as the most reliable clock available. The longer daylight lasted, the more work could be completed. During summer, that meant astonishingly early mornings. Long before most modern cities had even switched off their streetlights, medieval villagers might already be walking toward the fields. Imagine beginning your workday while stars still linger overhead. No coffee shop on the corner. No breakfast sandwich. Just damp grass beneath your boots and another 12 hours of physical labor waiting patiently ahead. Suddenly Monday mornings seem rather negotiable. Breakfast itself was usually simple. Don't imagine towering stacks of pancakes or elaborate buffets. Those belonged to another world entirely. Ordinary families often started the day with coarse bread. Perhaps yesterday's leftovers. Porridge made from oats or barley. Cheese if available. Ale or weak beer wasn't uncommon either. That surprises many people today. But medieval drinking water wasn't always dependable. Brewing created a safer beverage in many places, and the alcohol content of everyday ale was generally much lower than modern beer. Children drank it too. Not because medieval parents had unusually relaxed attitudes. Because clean hydration mattered more than modern expectations. It's one of those historical details that sounds shocking. Until you understand the circumstances. History does that rather often. The wealthy greeted the morning differently. Servants were already awake before their masters. Fireplaces burned. Clothing had been prepared. Wash basins filled. Breakfast organized. The lord or lady of the house often awoke to a room that seemed almost magically ready for the day. Of course. That magic consisted entirely of other people working extremely hard before sunrise. Large households operated like carefully organized machines. Every servant had responsibilities. Some prepared food. Others cleaned chambers. Some cared for horses. Others managed clothing, fires, candles, or supplies. If even one part of the system failed, everyone noticed. Especially whoever happened to outrank everyone else. Monasteries followed perhaps the most disciplined morning routine of all. Many monks had already been awake once during the night for prayers. Now another bell echoed through stone corridors. Not loud enough to startle. Just steady enough to remind everyone that another day of devotion had begun. There was no discussion. No negotiation. No lingering beneath warm blankets while promising to get up in just 5 more minutes. The bell rang. The monks rose. They dressed quietly. Walked through cold hallways. And gathered together once again for prayer. Discipline shaped every hour of the day. Even waking became an act of worship. There is something strangely calming about that level of routine. Demanding. Certainly. But predictable. And predictability has always offered comfort. Not everyone welcomed the morning quite so enthusiastically. Teenagers, it turns out, have always been teenagers. Parents occasionally complained that older children preferred sleeping longer than necessary. Young apprentices sometimes needed encouragement. Servants undoubtedly wished for another hour beneath warm blankets. History changes many things. It rarely changes human nature. Across centuries. Someone's mother has probably stood nearby saying, "Come on. It's time to get up." Some traditions are simply timeless. Weather determined the mood of the morning almost immediately. A bright summer sunrise promised productive fields. Heavy rain promised mud. Endless mud. Snow promised extra work before ordinary work even began. Strong winds meant worrying about roofs, fences, and crops. Unlike modern office workers, medieval people couldn't simply ignore the weather. It shaped almost every decision. A storm wasn't inconvenient. It could threaten survival. Naturally, people looked toward the sky every morning with careful attention. Clouds weren't just clouds. They were tomorrow's possibilities. As villages fully awakened, familiar sounds slowly filled the air. Blacksmiths lit their forges. Mill wheels began turning. Merchants opened wooden shutters. Women spun wool beside open doorways. Children carried water buckets almost as large as themselves. Smoke curled upward from dozens of chimneys. The sleepy silence of night disappeared. Another ordinary medieval day had begun. Yesterday had looked remarkably similar. Tomorrow probably would too. And strangely enough, there was comfort in that. Routine created stability. People knew their place. They understood the rhythm of the seasons. Life remained difficult. But it remained familiar. Perhaps that's why medieval sleep feels so fascinating today. It wasn't simply about closing your eyes. It connected to everything else. The weather. Religion. Family. Architecture. Medicine. Superstition. Work. Even politics. The way people slept revealed the world they lived in. A world where darkness inspired caution. Warmth represented survival. Dreams carried meaning. And sunrise always arrived with another long list of responsibilities. Still, our journey through medieval nights isn't over yet. Because while ordinary villagers struggled with cold rooms and straw mattresses, there were people whose bedtime routines became so unusual that they almost sound invented. Almost. In the next part, we'll step inside the bedrooms of eccentric nobles, restless rulers, and people whose sleeping habits were every bit as strange as the legends they've left behind. By now, you've spent enough nights in medieval Europe to realize something rather surprising. No one really had a perfect bedtime. The farmer was cold. The monk was sleep-deprived. The traveler shared a bed with strangers. Even the king couldn't completely escape freezing stone walls. But if there was one group of people who managed to make something as ordinary as going to bed wonderfully complicated, it was the nobility. Because medieval nobles rarely did anything quietly. Even sleep became a performance. Imagine you've been invited to spend the evening inside the home of an important lord. The great hall is glowing with hundreds of candles. Long wooden tables stretch across the room. The feast has lasted for hours. Musicians continue playing soft melodies while servants carry away empty plates. Guests are still talking. Someone near the fireplace has already begun telling the same hunting story for the third time. Nobody seems to mind. Wine continues flowing. The dogs lying beneath the tables are quietly hoping someone drops another piece of roasted meat. Eventually, the evening comes to an end. At least for most people. For the lord of the castle, bedtime is only just beginning. Unlike ordinary villagers, who simply climbed into bed whenever darkness arrived, powerful nobles often followed elaborate evening routines. Servants helped remove heavy outer garments. Layer after layer disappeared. Velvet cloaks. Fur-lined robes. Leather belts. Decorated boots. Medieval noble clothing could be surprisingly complicated. Getting dressed required assistance. So naturally, getting undressed did as well. One servant folded expensive garments. Another prepared fresh linen for the following morning. Someone else checked the fireplace. Another trimmed candles. Every small task belonged to somebody. Sleeping peacefully wasn't simply about comfort. It was also about placing oneself under divine protection before facing another uncertain night. Life remained fragile. Even inside castles. Now let's talk about one of history's more unusual pieces of bedroom furniture. The canopy bed. Today, canopy beds often appear in luxury hotels or historical dramas. They look elegant. Romantic. Perhaps slightly dramatic. In medieval Europe, they were wonderfully practical. Heavy curtains surrounded the entire bed. During winter they trapped precious warmth. During summer they offered a little protection from insects. They also reduced drafts moving through enormous stone rooms. It was essentially creating a smaller room inside a much larger room. Rather clever, really. Although climbing inside probably felt a little like entering an expensive blanket fort. Of course, the noble bed itself was an impressive object. Some were carved with elaborate patterns. Family symbols decorated wooden frames. Painted designs covered headboards. Expensive fabrics displayed wealth before anyone even lay down. The bed wasn't merely somewhere to sleep. It was furniture designed to impress visitors. Which may sound slightly odd. Until you remember that important guests were sometimes welcomed into private chambers. Bedrooms weren't always as private as modern people imagine. Business discussions could happen there. Political conversations could happen there. Even formal ceremonies occasionally took place there. The bedrooms served several purposes. Sleeping was simply one of them. Now here's something modern people often find rather surprising. Some medieval kings held official meetings while sitting in bed. Not because they felt lazy. Although perhaps occasionally. The bed represented authority. If a ruler felt ill, recovering from injury, or simply conducting early morning business, trusted advisors might enter the royal chamber to discuss serious matters. Imagine negotiating international politics before you've even finished waking up. One minister is discussing taxes. Another wants permission to repair castle walls. Someone else brings reports from distant borders. Meanwhile, you're still trying to remember whether you've actually opened both eyes. Leadership has never been especially relaxing. Privacy remained surprisingly limited. Even among the richest families. Important nobles rarely slept entirely alone. Servants frequently occupied nearby rooms. Personal attendants remained available throughout the night. Guards stood outside chamber doors. Visitors arrived unexpectedly. Messengers sometimes interrupted sleep with urgent news. A king might own the finest mattress in Europe, yet still struggle to enjoy uninterrupted rest. Power attracts responsibility. Responsibility rarely respects bedtime. The castle itself never completely fell asleep. Listen carefully. Somewhere outside. Boots strike against stone as guards patrol the walls. Far below. A stable boy checks whether nervous horses have settled. Kitchen servants prepare tomorrow's bread. The baker begins work while most people are still dreaming. The night watch circles the courtyard carrying a lantern. Its small light disappears briefly behind towers before appearing once again. Wind whistles through arrow slits cut into thick walls centuries earlier. A distant church bell echoes across the valley. Then silence returns. Only for a moment. Because castles breathed continuously. Like enormous stone creatures. Always awake somewhere. Always alive. Not every noble enjoyed peaceful dreams. Many spent their evenings worrying. Would the harvest provide enough taxes? Would neighboring lords remain loyal? Would disease spread through nearby villages? Would tomorrow bring another political disagreement? History often remembers medieval nobles for tournaments, banquets, and magnificent clothing. It remembers fewer of the sleepless nights spent worrying about responsibilities. Stress isn't particularly modern. People have been carrying tomorrow's problems into bed for thousands of years. Only the details have changed. Then there were the dreams themselves. Some nobles employed astrologers. Others consulted priests. A particularly vivid dream might be discussed over breakfast. Imagine dreaming about a white stag running through the forest. Today, you'd probably think that was unusual. A medieval noble might wonder whether heaven had just sent important advice. Dream interpretation became almost a hobby among certain courts. Books explaining symbolic meaning circulated among educated readers. A crown represented authority. A river represented change. Fire suggested danger. Birds carried messages. Whether those interpretations were accurate mattered less than the fact people sincerely believed they might be. Human beings have always searched for patterns. Dreams offered an endless supply. Perhaps the strangest part of noble bedtime wasn't the expensive furniture. Or the servants. Or even the elaborate routines. It was the simple realization that wealth couldn't purchase certainty. A feather mattress couldn't guarantee peaceful sleep. Silk sheets couldn't prevent nightmares. Gold couldn't persuade winter to become warmer. Every noble eventually closed their eyes exactly like everyone else. Hoping. Waiting. Trusting that dawn would arrive once again. And usually, it did. Because no matter how grand the castle, or how magnificent the bedroom, morning eventually found everyone. From the poorest shepherd sleeping beneath rough wool blankets, to the richest king resting beneath embroidered velvet, the night treated them all with remarkable fairness. Some slept deeply. Some barely slept at all. But all of them awakened beneath the same rising sun. And in our next journey, we'll leave the castles behind entirely. Instead, we'll wander into monasteries, remote villages, and lonely forests, where some of medieval Europe's strangest nighttime legends were born. By now, you've probably noticed something about medieval life. Most people desperately needed sleep. Not because sleeping was especially comfortable, but because tomorrow promised another day of hard work. Still, not everyone had the luxury of spending the entire night asleep. While most villages settled into silence, a small number of people were only just beginning their work. Because someone always had to remain awake. Someone had to watch the gates. Someone had to keep the fire alive. Someone had to ring the bells. Someone had to pray while everyone else dreamed. The Middle Ages never truly slept. It merely took turns. Let's begin inside a monastery. The village around it has fallen completely silent. Only the occasional owl breaks the stillness. The moon hangs above the stone buildings. Rows of tiny windows glow faintly with candlelight. Inside, dozens of monks lie asleep beneath simple wool blankets. The room is quiet enough that you can hear the wind brushing against the roof. Then, without warning, a bell echoes through the darkness. Not loudly. Not violently. Just steadily. 1, 2, 3. Within moments, robes rustle. Wooden beds creak. Sandaled feet touch cold stone floors. Nobody complains. Nobody asks for 5 more minutes. The bell has spoken. That is enough. The monks rise silently. Most say nothing at all. Silence itself is considered part of their discipline. One by one they light small candles. The tiny flames wobble as they move through narrow corridors. Their shadows stretch across ancient stone walls. Outside, the rest of the world continues sleeping. Inside, the monastery is awake. The brothers gather inside the chapel. The air is cool. Their breath hangs faintly before them during winter. Then, without hurry, the chanting begins. Low voices fill the room. Steady. Gentle. Almost hypnotic. The words rise toward the high ceiling before fading into silence again. Imagine hearing that while walking outside beneath the stars. A lonely traveler might never forget it. These nighttime prayers were known as the night office. For many religious communities, interrupting sleep wasn't considered an inconvenience. It was an offering. The quietest hours belonged to God. While everyone else rested, someone remained awake in prayer. To modern ears, it sounds exhausting. To medieval monks, it became normal. Routine has remarkable power. Even unusual routines eventually feel ordinary. After prayers ended, many monks didn't immediately return to sleep. Some remained reading. Reading by candlelight required patience. Candles were expensive. The light flickered constantly. Eyes grew tired quickly. Still, books were precious. Each manuscript represented hundreds of hours of careful work. Every page copied by hand. Every letter formed patiently. If you accidentally spilled candle wax across a manuscript. It was rather more serious than dropping your tablet. There was no backup copy waiting in the cloud. Only Brother Thomas quietly wondering why you were allowed near books in the first place. Elsewhere. Another group kept watch. Castle guards. Standing atop stone walls during winter sounds impressive. Until you remember. Winter. Imagine spending 6 hours outside while freezing wind blows directly across an open tower. No heated guardhouse. No insulated jacket. No hot coffee. Just thick wool clothing. A spear. Perhaps a lantern. And endless darkness stretching toward the forest. Every sound mattered. Branches breaking. A distant horse. Moving shadows. Most nights. Nothing happened. Thankfully. But guards couldn't assume tonight would be another peaceful evening. Their job depended on expecting trouble before trouble arrived. To help one another remain awake. Guards often called across the walls. One tower answered another. Short greetings echoed through the darkness. Less conversation. More reassurance. I'm still here. I'm awake. Everything is fine. Those simple exchanges probably sounded comforting. Especially on long winter nights. Silence can become unsettling. A familiar voice reminds everyone they aren't alone. Meanwhile. Inside medieval towns. Night watchmen wandered narrow streets carrying lanterns. Many announced the hours aloud. Others checked that doors remained secure. Some watched for fires. Fire frightened medieval communities more than almost anything else. Most buildings were made of wood. Roofs often contained straw. Houses stood close together. One careless flame could destroy an entire neighborhood before sunrise. The watchman's lantern therefore carried two meanings. Light. And warning. If danger appeared. He became the first person expected to notice. Not a particularly relaxing career. Watchmen also dealt with another surprisingly common problem. People wandering home after drinking far too much ale. Yes. Medieval taverns existed. And yes. People occasionally stayed longer than they probably should have. Some staggered home singing. Others attempted conversations with complete strangers. A few became convinced they were perfectly capable of winning arguments with geese. Alcohol has inspired confidence throughout human history. Accuracy has rarely accompanied it. Night watchmen occasionally guided these enthusiastic citizens home. Or encouraged them to continue walking before creating additional excitement. Even 700 years ago. Someone had to deal with noisy people after midnight. Back inside the villages. Another familiar figure remained awake. The miller. Or more accurately. The miller's water wheel. If the river flowed. The great wheel continued turning. Its slow rhythm became part of the landscape. Creak. Splash. Creak. Splash. Families sleeping nearby probably stopped noticing it entirely. Like modern people living beside train tracks. After enough time. Constant sounds simply disappear into everyday life. The human brain is wonderfully adaptable. Not everyone staying awake had chosen the responsibility. Parents with newborn babies understood interrupted sleep just as well as parents today. The baby didn't particularly care that tomorrow involved harvesting wheat. The baby certainly wasn't interested in sunrise schedules. If the baby decided midnight looked like an excellent time for crying, everyone else received that information immediately. Entire households woke together. Someone lit a candle. Someone warmed milk. Someone rocked the cradle. Eventually, peace returned. Until the next interruption. Some parts of parenting appear almost timeless. Travelers experienced perhaps the longest nights of all. Imagine arriving late at an unfamiliar village. The gates have already closed. The inn is full. Rain has started falling. Sleeping outside suddenly becomes your only option. You search for shelter beneath a tree. Perhaps inside an abandoned barn. Maybe beneath a rocky hillside. Every sound feels louder. Every gust of wind feels colder. The darkness stretches endlessly beyond the tiny circle of light from your lantern. It's no wonder medieval travelers filled Europe with stories. Spend enough nights alone beneath unfamiliar skies. And almost every shadow begins looking important. Sometimes fear creates legends. Sometimes legends create fear. Often, the two become impossible to separate. As dawn slowly approaches, the people who remained awake begin relaxing. The monastery grows quiet once more. The guards watch the eastern horizon becoming pale. The watchman finishes another peaceful patrol. The baker removes fresh bread from the oven. Smoke rises from chimneys across the village. Another night has passed safely. The world breathes again. Families wake. Children stretch beneath blankets. Farmers lace worn boots. Dogs trot into muddy yards. Life begins exactly where it paused the evening before. And somewhere, a tired night watchman finally heads home. Ready for the sleep everyone else has already enjoyed. Funny, isn't it? Most medieval people dreamed of getting enough sleep, while a handful quietly gave theirs away. Simply so everyone else could rest a little more peacefully. By now, you've survived castles, monasteries, village cottages, and enough medieval bedrooms to appreciate just how fortunate your own bed really is. You have escaped the fleas. Mostly. You've learned to ignore the goat sleeping suspiciously close to your pillow. You've accepted that waking up in the middle of the night wasn't considered unusual. And now, there's one last place we need to visit. The bed itself. Because medieval people didn't simply sleep on a bed. The bed represented wealth, status, family, privacy, sometimes even power. For something people spent nearly a third of their lives using. They thought about it surprisingly often. Now let's climb back into a noble household. Everything grows larger. The bed frame. The blankets. The pillows. Even the curtains. Some noble beds stood so high above the floor that small wooden steps became necessary. Climbing into bed almost resembled boarding a ship. Children probably found it wonderfully entertaining. Adults likely appreciated remaining farther away from chilly drafts moving across the floor. The higher the bed, the warmer the air. A surprisingly practical idea. Beds also became family heirlooms. A beautifully carved oak bed might survive several generations. One lord slept there. Then his son. Perhaps eventually a grandson. The same wooden frame quietly witnessed births, illnesses, celebrations, final farewells. Furniture lasted much longer than people. There's something strangely touching about that. Beds silently observed entire family histories without ever speaking a word. Of course, not everyone slept indoors. Shepherds sometimes spent nights beside their flocks. Soldiers slept wherever military campaigns carried them. Hunters rested beneath rough shelters built from branches. Travelers occasionally discovered that sleeping beneath the stars became unavoidable. It sounds wonderfully romantic. Until rain arrives. Or mosquitoes. Or both. A simple cloak became blanket, mattress, and roof all at once. Sleep came lightly. One ear remained open. Every unfamiliar sound encouraged another glance into the darkness. The countryside looked very different after sunset. Beautiful. Peaceful. And just mysterious enough to discourage wandering too far from the campfire. Weather changed everything. Summer brought entirely different sleeping habits. Heavy wool blankets became unnecessary. Doors sometimes remained open to encourage fresh air. Windows, where they existed, were uncovered. People welcomed every cool breeze. Winter. Well. Winter was another story entirely. Blankets multiplied. Curtains closed tightly. Families gathered close together. The fire burned until the very last possible moment. Cold remained everyone's unwanted bedtime companion. Nobody defeated winter. They simply endured it together. One detail historians often mention is how early medieval people usually went to bed. Without artificial lighting. Staying awake served little purpose. The sun disappeared. Work became difficult. Candles cost money. So people naturally aligned their schedules with daylight. Modern society has almost completely reversed this pattern. Many of us stay awake long after midnight beneath bright electric lights. Our ancestors would probably find that astonishing. And perhaps slightly unnecessary. Although they might become quite interested in refrigerators. Everyone has priorities. Perhaps the greatest misconception about medieval sleep is the idea that people simply tolerated terrible conditions without complaint. They didn't. They constantly searched for ways to improve life. Softer bedding. Warmer blankets. Better fireplaces. Stronger roofs. Cleaner homes. More comfortable furniture. Human beings have always wanted better sleep. The method simply changed with technology. The desire itself remained exactly the same. So tonight, as you settle beneath clean sheets, perhaps adjust your pillow. Maybe pull the blanket a little closer. Take a quiet moment to appreciate just how ordinary comfort has become. No smoky fireplace filling the room. No rooster debating sunrise outside your window. No straw poking through the mattress. No servants tightening bed ropes. No fear that your candle might accidentally burn the house down before morning. Just quiet. Warmth. And hopefully, a peaceful night's sleep. Because medieval people would almost certainly have considered your bedroom something remarkably close to magic. By now, you've survived the cold stone castles. You've survived the straw mattresses. You've survived the suspicious animals sharing sleeping spaces. And you've finally learned that medieval bedtime was not exactly the peaceful experience we imagine today. But there is one part of the medieval bedroom we haven't explored yet. The things people kept beside the bed. Because medieval people didn't simply climb under their blankets and hope for the best. They surrounded themselves with objects. Some were practical. Some were religious. Some were based on old beliefs. And some were simply a little strange. Today, the space beside our bed usually contains familiar things. A phone charger. A glass of water. A book. Maybe an alarm clock. Maybe a pile of clothes that was supposed to be organized 3 days ago. Modern bedside tables are mostly about convenience. Medieval bedside objects were often about survival. Protection. Comfort. And sometimes convincing yourself that the darkness outside wasn't filled with things waiting to ruin your night. Let's begin with one of the most important items. A source of light. The candle. For medieval people, having a candle nearby could be extremely useful. A person might wake during the night. Perhaps a child was crying. Perhaps the fire needed attention. Perhaps nature had decided that 3 in the morning was the perfect time to require a visit outside. Without a candle, moving through a dark house became a risky adventure. One wrong step could mean walking into furniture. Or falling over something left on the floor. Or discovering that the thing making noise was not what you hoped it was. The darkness had a way of making ordinary objects seem suspicious. A pile of clothing could become a creature. A hanging cloak could become a mysterious figure. A wooden chair could suddenly look like it had plans. The human imagination becomes very creative when the lights are gone. Of course. Candles created their own problems. Fire was one of the greatest dangers inside medieval homes. Many buildings contained wood. Roofs were often made with flammable materials. Open flames were everywhere. The fireplace. The kitchen. The candles. All it took was one accident. A candle falling over. A spark reaching dry material. Someone forgetting to put out a flame. And a peaceful night could become a disaster. This is why medieval people were often extremely careful around fire. A candle beside the bed was useful. But it was also something that demanded respect. Basically, your bedside lamp could also become your biggest enemy. A rather stressful relationship with lighting. Another common object near medieval beds was something connected to religion. The cross. For many medieval Europeans, faith was part of every moment of life. Including sleep. A small cross hanging near the bed. A prayer book placed nearby. A religious image on the wall. These objects provided comfort. They reminded people that they were not facing the darkness alone. Remember, night could feel very different without electricity. The world outside disappeared. The house became quiet. Every sound seemed larger. A symbol of protection offered reassurance. Some people kept small religious items called relics. These could be objects connected to saints or holy figures. Many believed such items carried special spiritual importance. A person might sleep near one hoping for protection, better health, peaceful dreams, or simply the comfort of feeling connected to something greater. To modern people, this might seem unusual. But humans have always surrounded themselves with objects that make them feel safe. Today we might keep lucky items. Old photographs. Childhood objects. Special gifts. The meaning changes. The feeling remains. Then there were herbs. Medieval people had a strong relationship with plants. Not just for food. Plants were used for medicine, cleaning, religious ceremonies, and sometimes sleep. Certain herbs were placed near beds because people believed their smell could encourage rest or keep away unwanted problems. Lavender, rosemary, mint, sweet-smelling flowers. These could be tucked into bedding or hung nearby. A medieval bedroom could actually smell surprisingly pleasant. At least when the herbs were fresh. Of course. Fresh flowers and herbs could only do so much. They were fighting against smoke, animals, old straw, and hundreds of other medieval smells. A difficult battle. Some people placed objects beneath their pillows. This practice existed in different forms across medieval Europe. A person might keep a small charm, a religious item, a piece of clothing, or something believed to bring good fortune. The pillow became a personal little storage area. Almost like a medieval bedside drawer. Except much softer. And much easier to lose things inside. Speaking of pillows. They were not always the soft, comfortable objects we imagine. For wealthy households, pillows could be luxurious. Filled with feathers. Covered in fine fabric. Decorated beautifully. For ordinary people, a rolled-up piece of clothing often worked perfectly well. The purpose was simple. Raise the head. Provide some comfort. Prevent sleeping directly on a hard surface. Luxury came later. First came practicality. Another important item near the medieval bed was a chamber pot. Yes. The famous object nobody wants to discuss. But it was an important part of daily life. Imagine waking up in the middle of a freezing winter night. Outside temperatures are below freezing. The ground is muddy. The nearest outdoor toilet is not exactly nearby. The solution? A container kept inside. Convenient. Practical. And perhaps not the most romantic addition to the bedroom. But medieval life was not trying to impress anyone. It was trying to function. In wealthy households, servants often handled these unpleasant tasks. A noble person might never have to worry about carrying waste outside. Someone else was responsible. This was one of the many hidden advantages of wealth. Not just better food. Not just larger houses. Sometimes. Simply avoiding inconvenient chores. Luxury has always been surprisingly practical. Another strange bedside object was the knife. Especially among travelers and some ordinary people. Keeping a weapon nearby while sleeping was not unusual. Life was less predictable. Homes were not always perfectly secure. Travel was dangerous. People sometimes wanted something within reach if trouble appeared. A knife had many uses. Cooking. Crafting. Daily work. And, if necessary, protection. Of course. Sleeping beside a sharp object probably required some confidence. Especially after waking suddenly in complete darkness. Nobody wanted their first challenge of the morning to be accidentally fighting their own blanket. Soldiers took this even further. For someone living a military life, weapons were not simply tools. They were part of daily existence. A soldier might sleep near his equipment because he needed to be ready quickly. Campaigns rarely offered comfortable conditions. A bed could be a patch of ground. A blanket. A shelter. And whatever protection you carried. The line between sleeping and staying prepared was very thin. Even nobles kept important objects near their beds. Jewelry. Documents. Keys. Personal treasures. The bedroom often contained valuable possessions. Before modern banking systems, wealth had to be protected physically. A locked chest beside the bed was common. It stored clothing, money, important papers, family items. The bed was not just where you rested. It was where many valuable things remained close. And then, there were the objects people kept because of fear. Not practical fear. The mysterious kind. Charms against bad dreams. Objects believed to protect against evil spirits. Items connected to local traditions. Medieval Europe was filled with beliefs about the unseen world. A person could believe completely in prayer, medicine, and magical protection all at the same time. Modern people sometimes separate these ideas. Medieval people often blended them together. If something might help, why not try it? Perhaps the strangest part is that the medieval bedroom was never truly empty. Every object had a purpose. The candle provided light. The herbs provided comfort. The cross provided faith. The knife provided security. The chest protected valuables. The blanket provided warmth. Everything around the bed told a story about the person sleeping there. Their fears. Their beliefs. Their daily struggles. Their hopes for tomorrow. So tonight, when you look at your own bedside table, take a moment to appreciate how simple it feels. A charger. A lamp. A book. Maybe a glass of water. No candle threatening to burn the house down. No charm hidden beneath your pillow. No knife waiting beside the mattress. No need to worry whether a strange sound outside is a thief. Or something much worse. Modern bedtime has become wonderfully boring. And honestly, that might be the greatest luxury of all. Because after centuries of humans trying to make sleep safer, warmer, and more comfortable, we finally reached a point where going to bed is mostly just going to bed. A surprisingly impressive achievement. By now, you have discovered that medieval sleep was not simply about finding a place to lie down. It was a complete experience. A battle against cold, noise, darkness, animals, insects, and occasionally, your own imagination. You have survived the straw mattress. You have accepted the candle beside the bed. You have learned that a small knife, a religious charm, and a suspicious amount of herbs could all become normal bedroom objects. But there is something else that made medieval bedtime even stranger. The rules. Because medieval people had many ideas about what you should and should not do before sleeping. Some were practical. Some were connected to medicine. And some were wonderfully strange. Today, our bedtime rules are usually simple. Don't drink too much coffee late. Don't stare at your phone for hours. Try to sleep at a reasonable time. Modern advice mostly focuses on helping the body rest. Medieval advice had a much larger goal. Keeping the entire body balanced. Because medieval doctors believed sleep affected everything. Your health. Your mood. Your digestion. Even your personality. A bad night's sleep was not just annoying. It could mean something was wrong inside your body. One common belief was that what you ate before bed mattered greatly. Medieval medical writers spent a surprising amount of time discussing food and sleep. Heavy meals could disturb rest. Certain foods were considered difficult to digest. Others were believed to encourage better sleep. The logic was based on the medical ideas of the time. The body needed balance. Too much of anything could create problems. Of course, the exact details were not always correct. But the basic idea that food affects sleep? That part remained surprisingly familiar. A medieval person might think carefully about their evening meal. A huge feast right before bed? The stomach, according to medieval thinking, needed time to work. Otherwise, your dreams might become strange. Your sleep might become restless. And your body might become unhappy. Which is something many modern people understand after eating a very large meal and immediately trying to lie down. Some experiences are timeless. Another interesting bedtime rule involved the direction you slept. Yes. Some medieval people believed the position of the body mattered. The direction your head faced. The arrangement of the bed. The way you positioned yourself. All of these could supposedly influence health. Some beliefs came from religion. Others came from older medical traditions. The world was full of invisible connections. The placement of a bed was not always just about convenience. Sometimes it was about harmony. Windows also received attention. Today, we open or close windows depending on temperature. Medieval people did the same. But they also worried about drafts. Cold air was believed by many to be dangerous. A sudden chill could affect the body. Especially during sleep. So beds were carefully positioned away from cold openings whenever possible. Curtains became useful. Walls became valuable. A warm sleeping area was something worth protecting. Then there was the question of clothing. Should you sleep fully dressed? Partially dressed? Wear special night clothing? The answer depended on wealth, location, and custom. Wealthier people often had specific garments for sleeping. Simple linen clothing was common. But ordinary workers usually cared more about practicality. Clothing was expensive. Fabric required enormous effort. You didn't create unnecessary extra outfits just because bedtime existed. A medieval farmer was not standing in front of a wardrobe thinking, "Which sleeping outfit represents my personality tonight?" The options were usually clean clothes or the other clothes. Night clothing could also reveal social status. A noble person's sleeping garments might use finer materials. Soft linen. Decorative stitching. Better quality fabric. A poor worker's sleeping clothes were much simpler. But both served the same purpose. Protection from cold. Comfort. A little dignity before sleep. Another strange medieval bedtime belief involved bathing. Today, many people enjoy a warm shower before bed. Medieval bathing habits were much more complicated. Some people bathed regularly. Others avoided frequent bathing depending on local customs and beliefs. Cleanliness existed. But ideas about health were different. Some doctors believed too much bathing could weaken the body. Others valued washing. The result was a wide variety of habits across different regions. History rarely gives one simple answer. Especially when talking about millions of people living across hundreds of years. The wealthy had another bedtime tradition. Being watched. Yes. Even sleep could become a social activity. Important nobles sometimes had attendants nearby. The stomach, according to medieval thinking, needed time to work. Otherwise, your dreams might become strange. Your sleep might become restless. And your body might become unhappy. Which is something many modern people understand after eating a very large meal and immediately trying to lie down. Some experiences are timeless. Another interesting bedtime rule involved the direction you slept. Yes. Some medieval people believed the position of the body mattered. The direction your head faced. The arrangement of the bed. The way you positioned yourself. All of these could supposedly influence health. Some beliefs came from religion. Others came from older medical traditions. The world was full of invisible connections. The placement of a bed was not always just about convenience. Sometimes it was about harmony. Windows also received attention. Today, we open or close windows depending on temperature. Medieval people did the same. But they also worried about drafts. Cold air was believed by many to be dangerous. A sudden chill could affect the body. Especially during sleep. So beds were carefully positioned away from cold openings whenever possible. Curtains became useful. Walls became valuable. A warm sleeping area was something worth protecting. Then there was the question of clothing. Should you sleep fully dressed? Partially dressed? Wear special night clothing? The answer depended on wealth, location, and custom. Wealthier people often had specific garments for sleeping. Simple linen clothing was common. But ordinary workers usually cared more about practicality. Clothing was expensive. Fabric required enormous effort. You didn't create unnecessary extra outfits just because bedtime existed. A medieval farmer was not standing in front of a wardrobe thinking, "Which sleeping outfit represents my personality tonight?" The options were usually clean clothes or the other clothes. Night clothing could also reveal social status. A noble person's sleeping garments might use finer materials. Soft linen. Decorative stitching. Better quality fabric. A poor worker's sleeping clothes were much simpler. But both served the same purpose. Protection from cold. Comfort. A little dignity before sleep. Another strange medieval bedtime belief involved bathing. Today, Many people enjoy a warm shower before bed. Medieval bathing habits were much more complicated. Some people bathed regularly. Others avoided frequent bathing depending on local customs and beliefs. Cleanliness existed. But ideas about health were different. Some doctors believed too much bathing could weaken the body. Others valued washing. The result was a wide variety of habits across different regions. History rarely gives one simple answer. Especially when talking about millions of people living across hundreds of years. The wealthy had another bedtime tradition. Being watched. Yes. Even sleep could become a social activity. Important nobles sometimes had attendants nearby. A servant might help prepare the bed. Another might manage candles. Someone might check clothing for the morning. The process of going to sleep could involve several people. Which sounds strange today. Imagine announcing, "Please prepare my sleeping area." And 5 people immediately begin working. Royal life had many conveniences. Privacy was not always one of them. Children had their own bedtime traditions. Parents often told stories. Religious lessons. Family histories. Local legends. These stories helped children understand the world around them. But medieval bedtime stories were not always the gentle fairy tales we know today. Many carried warnings. Lessons. Moral messages. Children learned about good behavior. Danger. Faith. And the consequences of making poor choices. Basically, the bedtime story was sometimes entertainment. And sometimes a quiet lecture. A tradition parents still understand perfectly. Dreams also influenced bedtime rules. Because dreams were taken seriously. Before sleeping, some people tried to prepare themselves spiritually. Prayers. Reflections. Religious rituals. The goal was to enter sleep with a peaceful mind. A troubled soul might experience troubled dreams. At least, that was the belief. So bedtime became a transition. Not simply between being awake and asleep, but between the ordinary world and the mysterious world of dreams. Of course, not every medieval person followed every rule. Just like today. People received advice. People ignored advice. Some probably ate too much before bed. Some probably stayed awake too late. Some probably complained that their mattress was uncomfortable. Human nature has a funny habit of remaining consistent. A medieval villager and a modern person may have more in common than we expect. Both want comfort. Both dislike being cold. Both enjoy sleeping peacefully. Both occasionally ignore good advice. And perhaps that is the most interesting thing about medieval bedtime rules. They reveal something very familiar. People from the Middle Ages were not strange creatures living completely different lives. They were humans trying to solve the same problems we still have. How do we sleep better? How do we stay comfortable? How do we feel safe? How do we make the night less difficult? The answers changed. The questions stayed the same. So tonight, when you prepare for bed, think about how many small decisions happen without you noticing. The temperature. The lighting. The position of your pillow. The clothes you wear. The sounds around you. Modern people still create bedtime rituals. We simply use different tools. A medieval person might place herbs beside their bed. You might adjust your room temperature. They might pray for peaceful dreams. You might listen to relaxing sounds. They might worry about spirits. You might worry about tomorrow's schedule. Different centuries. Similar minds. And as the medieval night slowly continued, another strange part of sleep was waiting. Because not everyone believed sleep was simply a time of rest. Some believed the sleeping body could experience things far beyond ordinary understanding. And in the next part, we'll explore medieval sleepwalking, strange dreams, nighttime visions, and the mysterious things people believed happened while they were unconscious. By now, you have spent an entire medieval night journeying through almost every strange corner of sleep. You have survived smoky candles, cold stone castles, crowded beds, restless animals, suspicious noises, nighttime prayers, royal bedrooms, and enough fleas to make you seriously appreciate modern laundry. But there is still one final mystery waiting in the darkness. A strange moment when the boundary between sleeping and waking became surprisingly thin. A moment when people could move, speak, and even perform complicated actions, while their minds were still somewhere else. Sleepwalking. Today, if someone walks around the house while asleep, most people understand what is happening. The brain is caught between different stages of sleep. The body becomes active while consciousness remains partially disconnected. It can look strange, sometimes funny, sometimes confusing. But we generally understand that it is a natural sleep behavior. Medieval people had a very different explanation. Because to them, the sleeping body was not always completely under human control. And that created some fascinating ideas. Imagine living in a small medieval village. The entire household has gone quiet. The fire has become a glowing pile of ashes. Everyone is asleep beneath heavy blankets. Rain taps gently against the wooden roof. Then suddenly, someone stands up. Not awake. Not fully asleep. They walk across the room. Their eyes are open. But they do not respond. A family member whispers their name. Nothing. They continue moving through the darkness. For a modern person, this is unusual. For a medieval family, it could be deeply unsettling. Because nobody was completely sure what was happening. One common belief was that sleep allowed the soul to become less connected to the body. People believed dreams happened because the mind could experience things beyond ordinary reality. So if someone moved while sleeping, perhaps some part of them was still traveling. Perhaps their soul was wandering. Perhaps they were caught between two worlds. The sleeping body remained behind, while another part of the person experienced something unknown. It was not just a strange habit. It was a mystery. And medieval people loved mysteries. Of course, religion played a major role in how sleepwalking was understood. The medieval world was deeply religious. Almost every unusual event had some connection to spiritual ideas. A person having strange dreams? Perhaps a message. Someone seeing visions? Perhaps a sign. A person walking through the night without awareness? Perhaps something happening beyond ordinary understanding. Some people wondered whether supernatural forces were involved. Others believed the person was simply experiencing unusual dreams. The explanation depended heavily on the person, place, and time. Just like today, people searched for answers using the knowledge they had available. Sleepwalking could also become mixed with stories about magic and witchcraft. This was especially true when unusual behavior frightened communities. A person wandering outside at night might attract suspicion. A neighbor who behaved strangely might become the subject of rumors. Remember, medieval villages were small communities. Everyone knew everyone. A strange event didn't disappear quickly. It became a story. And stories grew. A person who simply walked around while asleep could eventually become connected to legends about spirits, curses, or mysterious nighttime journeys. Human imagination has always been very talented at adding extra details. Children were often the most common sleepwalkers. which probably made the situation even more confusing. Imagine a small child quietly leaving bed in the middle of the night. The parents wake up. They find their child standing near the fireplace. Or walking toward the doorway. Or talking softly to someone who isn't there. Today, parents might recognize this behavior. A medieval parent might simply feel frightened and protective. They would guide the child back to bed. Offer prayers. Perhaps ask for blessings. Then hope the strange event never happened again. Dreams themselves were taken very seriously. And this made sleepwalking even more interesting. Many medieval people believed dreams could reveal hidden truths. A dream wasn't just random images created by the sleeping brain. It could contain warnings, advice, temptations, or messages. So a sleepwalker wandering through the house might not simply be moving. They might be acting out something happening inside their dream. A person searching for something in their sleep may have believed they were searching for something important. A person speaking strange words may have been repeating something meaningful. The sleeping mind remained a mysterious place. Monasteries also had their own stories about unusual nighttime experiences. Monks spent enormous amounts of time thinking about the relationship between the body, mind, and soul. They recorded dreams. They discussed visions. They wrote about temptations that appeared during sleep. Nighttime experiences became subjects of serious reflection. A monk waking after a powerful dream might spend hours considering what it meant. Was it a spiritual message? A warning? A distraction? A test of faith? Sleep was not simply rest. It was another place where the human struggle continued. Of course. Not every strange nighttime event was mysterious. Sometimes people were simply exhausted. And medieval people were very, very tired. A farmer who spent 14 hours working in the fields. A servant carrying supplies around a castle. A mother caring for children. A monk waking repeatedly during the night for prayers. Their bodies experienced enormous physical stress. Sleep became deep. The line between sleeping and waking became easier to cross. Modern science explains much of this. But medieval people experienced the same human behaviors. They simply described them differently. There was another nighttime behavior that fascinated medieval observers. Talking during sleep. Today, sleep talking is usually ignored. Someone mumbles a few words. Their partner laughs. The moment passes. In medieval households, it could become a source of curiosity. What exactly was the sleeper saying? Were they revealing hidden thoughts? Were they speaking with spirits? Were they remembering something important? A sleeping person's words sometimes carried more meaning than they actually deserved. Because silence at night made every sound feel significant. And then there was the question everyone wondered about. Could a person be responsible for something they did while asleep? This became a surprisingly complicated idea. If someone acted without awareness, were they truly responsible? Medieval thinkers debated many questions about human actions, intention, and the soul. The sleeping person was not completely awake. Their choices were not fully conscious. So how should their actions be understood? Even hundreds of years ago, people were asking questions that still interest scientists and philosophers today. Perhaps the strangest thing about medieval sleepwalking is how familiar it actually feels. The explanations changed. The fears changed. The stories changed. But the experience itself remained human. People have always woken from strange dreams. Always talked in their sleep. Always experienced moments where the mind behaved unexpectedly. The night has always been mysterious. Even when we understand more about it, it still feels a little strange. So, as this final medieval night comes to an end, The village slowly wakes. The fire is rebuilt. The animals become noisy. The first light appears beyond the fields. The person who wandered during the night remembers nothing. The family returns to ordinary routines. Another strange bedtime event becomes just another story passed down through generations. And that is perhaps the most fascinating thing about medieval sleep. People were not so different from us. They worried. They dreamed. They struggled to rest. They searched for comfort. They feared the darkness. They hoped for a peaceful morning. Their beds were harder. Their rooms were colder. Their nights were stranger. But the simple desire remained exactly the same. To close your eyes. To feel safe. And to wake up when the sun returns. So tonight, as you lie beneath your comfortable blanket, in your quiet room, with your soft mattress, and absolutely no chance of accidentally wandering into a medieval village while asleep, remember something. For thousands of years, humans have ended every day the same way. By searching for a little warmth, a little peace, and a few hours where the world finally becomes quiet. The medieval night was strange. Sometimes uncomfortable. Sometimes frightening. Sometimes completely ridiculous. But it was still home. And after all these centuries, sleep remains one of the few things that connects us perfectly with the people who lived long before us. Good night. And thankfully, your mattress does not contain straw.